morning. And I apologize for coming in a bit late, and that would be quite cliche that the New York City person kind of couldn't find his way around Long Island to get here, but it was more the Nassau County person who really couldn't find his way in Suffolk, because I went to the other Malloy College, the one in Nassau, because really growing up in Mineola, there really was no Suffolk. Like, it just, it's just like in Manhattan, in Brooklyn, you always go towards Manhattan and you never go east, you never go to Queens. When you're in Nassau, you kind of go into the city and you never go to Suffolk. So it's just a thing. So everyone who's further out east, I apologize, is very cliche. But I'm really excited to come here and talk about Vision Zero and to be back on Long Island. And before I get into sort of the details, I sort of have some formative experiences on Long Island, which really, decades later, I think, contributed to the work that and the career path that I ended up pursuing. My parents' home was on First Street in Mineola, which is the old pre-war rail suburb, walking distance to the Long Island Railroad station. My father commuted into the city on the railroad. It was only about a 10-minute walk, but he was always sleeping late, and he rode a 3-speed women's bicycle with a flower basket on the front to the train station pretty much every day. And the way the generations played out, all of my classmates were in the post-war Levittown-style developments on the other side of Jericho Turnpike, north of Jericho Turnpike, and we were in the mainline suburb south of Jericho Turnpike. And I'm sure kids today probably aren't allowed to just take their bike and bike around their town, but Mineola the streets were nice enough to do that, and I was allowed to do that, but I wasn't allowed to cross Jericho Turnpike, and everyone lived on the other side of Jericho Turnpike, and I was not allowed to cross, and it was this major barrier between a social life and a major safety concern. And the other thing was around Jericho Turnpike was our middle school was on the south side of Jericho Turnpike, and the Friendlies, where we all went to after our middle school dances, was on the north side. And we would actually be allowed, when those dances ended, to walk to the Friendlies. That was the tradition, to go get your ice cream sundae and hang out and continue the social festivities. And when I was in 7th grade, a friend of mine in the 8th grade was hit by a car crossing to Friendlies. He survived, but I arrived just after, and the scene of my 8th grade friend, bloody with police and all of that, really was, a serious thing, and sort of, like I said, a bit of a formative experience, and really goes to show the importance of taming our bigger streets, of making them complete, and the potential and the social role that our streets have of either stitching us together or driving us apart. So anyway, with that long introduction about Long Island, I want to get into what's been happening over the last 2 years in the Vision Zero program in New York, and give some background of why we have a Vision Zero, what it's like, and what we've been up to, and what our accomplishments have been. So first of all, I think this audience knows that we have a 9/11 every month in this country. 3,000 people dying in traffic crashes, and if that was, the aviation industry, we used to have, similar fatality numbers, and we designed fatalities out of that transportation system. In the last 10 years, commercial aviation in the United States has basically no fatalities, and Vision Zero is really trying to take that attitude that we can design fatalities out of our system. We really need to take that and put that in our culture, put that in our decision making. And you see, I've got some numbers for Long Island, that the fatality numbers are actually in New York City and Long Island are somewhat similar. But when we adjust it for our population, I actually have some bad news for you guys. In the country, we put 100,000 people in the Rose Bowl. 10 of them are going to die in a traffic fatality in the next 12 months. New York City, our 8.5 million people, are actually the safest people in the country. You put 100,000 in Yankee Stadium, we're going to have 3.3 traffic fatalities in that year. Long Island is fortunately better than the rest of the country, but at that 7.8 per 100,000, a lot worse than New York City. And then the most amazing thing, the orange, is the pedestrian fatality per 100,000 residents. We all know that New York City, there's a lot more walking than anywhere in the country, yet our pedestrian fatality rate, and a lot more walking than in Long Island, our pedestrian fatality rate per 100,000 residents is lower in New York City than it is on Long Island, which is really kind of, I think, the most mind-blowing number when you sort of think about it, and really speaks to the sort of safety in numbers effect that we have in New York City. Our drivers are used to experiencing pedestrians. Our streets were built in that pre-war auto era, and we've been doing a lot of work. So a big take home there. So as Eric pointed out, we've had a very aggressive complete street program that I've been helping manage since 2007. The Bloomberg administration, Plan YC, our great former transportation commissioner, Jeanette Sadekhan, doing things like this, taking big 3-lane roads, adding bike lanes, turn lanes, large pedestrian medians, doing protected bike lanes, reconfiguring our most complex intersections, creating new public space, and incorporating pedestrian amenities near subway stations, connecting bus to subway to the neighborhood crossings and pedestrian medians, neighborhood slow zones, lowering speed limits in neighborhood slow zones to 20 miles an hour. So we did all those things, but we still have a problem with traffic fatalities, and Vision Zero really is the move from opportunity to strategy around safety. So just giving you the long view, we have our pedestrian and total traffic fatalities since 1910. We have that data in New York City. You see the large spike in 1929 when the stock market crashed and a bunch of people threw themselves in front of cars there, but you see a great long-term trend of decline. In the 1950s, we actually had 450 pedestrian fatalities a year on average in that decade, and that was about 3/4 of our traffic fatalities. By the 2000s, that was down to around 170 a year in that decade, and they were half of our traffic fatalities. So really wonderful progress. And it looked even better as we started this decade, 142 fatalities. But because of advances in street design and in vehicle design, the percentage that were pedestrians started to creep up to 57% by 2012. Again, sort of similar, 150, maybe it's not, we don't really have a problem. And then in our election year, 2013, 183 pedestrian fatalities and over 60% of the total. So really, as proud as we were of the street design work we were doing and the long-term trend, really something that was a need to spur action with what was happening in 2013. The other real why we need a Vision Zero is our senior citizens. New York is really a wonderful retirement community. It is a place where our senior citizens can have an independently mobile life, maintain connections to community because of density, community centers, and really live a wonderful life and not be sort of dependent on their ability to drive a car in order to have access to independence. The problem is they are much more likely to perish if they are struck by a car. So while they make up just 12% of our population, they're well over 1/3 of our pedestrian fatalities. Now, if you just hold because of that, you see if you're under 65, your pedestrian fatality rate is 1.4 per 100,000. If you're over 65, the pedestrian fatality rate is 5 per 100,000 in our city. Now, we couple that with the fact that we just hit the baby boom aging wave. We're going to add 300,000 new senior citizens. We're going to add a city's worth of senior citizens over the next 15, 20 years. You apply that pedestrian fatality rate, and we're going to have fatalities go up. rather than down in sort of the do-nothing scenario. So as proud as we are of our low rate, we have some serious challenges and need to really be focused on this issue. 1.3 million senior citizens will be in New York City by 2030. So the city was ready for Vision Zero, and the 2013 election was really the moment where, you know, our transportation policy over the prior mayor was sort of being, you know, what would the new mayor sort of establish as their transportation policy? Would we move away from the complete streets, from the bike network, from the safety work that we had been prioritizing? And Vision Zero was really something that the advocates sort of said, we need our mayor to be focused on continuing this work and bringing it to the next level. And one of the key things they did during the election that sort of happened is, because of all these tragedies, the families of people who lost loved ones made all the difference in the world, got engaged in this debate and in this dialogue. So people on the bottom left, that's a woman who lost her 13-year-old son in a traffic crash. And she said, you know, most people who experience a tragedy like this, they, you know, sort of, you know, they might move to another city and not talk about it, and it's just this horrible inner tragedy. People here in New York City are turning this into action to hold their elected officials, their public officials accountable for making streets safe and having a plan to prevent those tragedies from happening to other people. And so that call during the election and that call after the election has led to our mayor, Mayor de Blasio, being a real national leader and embracing Vision Zero in a way that that has given us the resources and the ability to do what we've been doing there. So what we've been doing sort of falls into kind of four buckets here, some traditional buckets. You know, the first in legislation is, of course, our default 25-mile-per-hour speed limit, which is actually, you know, there's a long history of speed limits where basically you had, you know, in the sort of auto expansion era, you had villages who wanted to preserve their quality of life, and then roads in between those villages where people would drive fast, and you know, county or state people would set a high speed limit. It was low density, and then they would come into the villages, and the villages would set, you know, say go 20 miles an hour, go 15 miles an hour, go 25 miles an hour, and people got tickets when they would go into the villages. And state legislatures saw that as unfair and speed traps for the motoring public. And they tied the hands of municipalities all over the country with these speed trap laws that basically don't let localities give them the flexibility that they would like around speed limits. So in 1964, almost 50 years to the day to when we changed it back, the state legislature forced us to have a 30-mile-per-hour default speed limit over the objection of basically my predecessor, Henry Barnes, that's the New York Times article from 1964, where we said, we don't think 30 miles an hour makes sense on the thousands of miles of small residential streets that make up our city. So again, thanks to that advocacy and thanks to the mayor's advocacy, we did get the state legislature to change that default speed limit where we don't have signed posted speed limits to 25 miles an hour. And it's a real signature achievement. Our planning, so we immediately called for, we did an action plan. That one of the mayor's first press conferences, he was sworn in January 1st, 2014. There was a bad January, continuing the bad 2013, bad January 2014 for traffic fatalities. The mayor called a press conference on January 14th or 15th and said we're going to have an action plan in 1 month. By mid-February, we released our action plan around Vision Zero, 63 initiatives, comprehensive initiatives. But what we sort of tasked ourselves with was developing borough-specific plans around our streets and targeting our enforcement and engineering and education activities. And so these borough plans, which are available on our website, involved a public engagement process where we had a dialogue with our communities around roundtables, around hearing from them what are their big issues. Is it not enough time to cross the street? Is it speeding traffic? Is it failure to yield? Is it cyclists going the wrong way or riding on the sidewalks? We gave them all those choices, but then we could sort of highlight what the communities thought were the big issues. And then we married that with, we had a public input website where people could do the same thing, and then we did crash rate analysis. And having done this work for many years, we are obviously advocates for better street design, but we're also the people who can be blamed for a lot of things as public officials, right? You could say that street is dangerous. I think our friends in Tri-State like to put out a report pointing out the most dangerous streets, and our press people are always like, oh, they named one of our streets, and is that true? And then the local papers, ask us to comment and why you're operating these horrible, dangerous streets. So anyway, you can go into a very defensive mode in this work. And what we said was we get beat up over the streets. People complain about streets with high crash rates and low crash rates. And often people in safer neighborhoods will say, I need a stop sign, or I have a speeding problem. And the press will take up those stories. They will say, why don't you, and we'll get a lot of pressure to fix the streets where actually the data isn't a problem. So we decided to take the leap and say, okay, we're going to publish a very clear set of maps with the crash data, with the fatality data, with the pedestrian severe injury data, and say, these are the streets where those things are concentrated. So, for each borough, we basically highlighted on the map the corridors that make up half of our severe injuries. So in Queens, for example, 47 streets, only 6% of our street mileage are where half of our severe injuries happen. So by going and putting that out on a map, we said, okay, we're going to get beat up one way or the other by folks. We might as well have them beat us up about the right places. So that was an important leap in the Vision Zero era. And that data is right there in the back for someone to say exactly how many fatalities, exactly how many severe injuries happened on these streets in the last 5 years. Vision Zero is a culture change project. It has to do what Mothers Against Drunk Driving did for the culture of drunk driving 30, 40 years ago. It has to do that for reckless driving and speeding. And so education is a key part of the Vision Zero framework here. We need to change people's mindset, because the reality is we're not going to redesign every single street. And even when we do redesign them, people will still need to look out for one another, be cautious, and make wise choices with their while driving, which is what has been the emphasis of our education message, is that your choices matter. Everyone is making choices when they're out on our streets. And we've got some hard-hitting education. We've got some commercials which gained a lot of publicity. They're on our YouTube website, and they are having an effect. We've done some survey work about how is the mindset changing in New York, and almost 3/4 recall seeing the campaign, and 3/4 of them report that the ads compel them to expect more enforcement, and 86% of drivers report that the ads convince them to pay more attention to pedestrians and cyclists while driving. So that is very, very strong results for an education campaign. So we're hoping to keep that going in the Vision Zero era as we move forward. Speaking of enforcement, the New York Police Department, we're at the Transportation Department. We're passionate about operating safe and high mobility streets. The police department has a big job about keeping us safe from crime. We're only 14 years or so removed from 9/11. We have terrorism concerns with the murder rate. It's been a project to get them as passionate about traffic safety as we are. But I think with the new mayor and the new police commissioner, I think the murder rate had gone down so far, and we got far enough away from 9/11, I think, that the new police commissioner, Bill Bratton, looked at the numbers, and the brass of NYPD was like, wow, the amount of people dying in traffic crashes is kind of really close to the same amount dying in murders. Murders used to be 2,000, now it's 500, and we have 300, so. And he realized that a life loss is a life loss, and that they really need to get on. If they're in the public safety business, they need to sort of jump on board this initiative. And the NYPD has done that. They've stepped up. There have been two primary things in New York City, which is motorists failing to yield when turning. That's when we give people a walk signal and a green light to go straight, parallel, but if you turn, you have to yield to the pedestrian. And we have a very good yielding culture in New York City, but not good enough because too many of our pedestrians are struck when on a turn. So, and that was not a normal summons for the police to give out. So failure to yield has been a major focus, and we're really trying to change that culture. I happen to find that the worst non-yielders, every time someone cuts me off or someone else off, it's New Jersey plates. So you do your own little experiment, but when one with New York plates does it, I assume they're from Long Island, unfortunately. You know, when you come into our city, please yield to our pedestrians. Speeding enforcement, manual speeding enforcement is not an easy thing to do on crowded streets. It's typically something when you want shoulders on a highway. We have a highway patrol, which does a lot of speeding enforcement. We've been bringing the speed enforcement to our arterial streets, our more minor streets, and training the precincts to get in that business. So we have a major growth in speeding enforcement, which is tremendous for Vision Zero and showing the NYP getting on board. But we all know that the NYPD can't be everywhere at all the time, so automated enforcement is a major part of our strategy, and probably you know, something, a source of maybe frustration here on Long Island, given what's happened. But you know, we've had a red light camera program for a long time, which I believe you guys have as well, and this is just that automated enforcement works. This is our violation rate per camera over 20 years and 30 years, and the number of active red light cameras. But our speed camera program, right before Vision Zero 2013, we achieved authorization to have 20 speed cameras, a minuscule amount. And then, thankfully, Nassau County went bankrupt and needed a lot of money and asked the state legislature to get them school zone speed cameras. And the legislature was giving out the speed cameras to Nassau and Suffolk. And we said, hey, if you're going to give them to Nassau and Suffolk, you got to proportionally give them to us too. So our 20 camera program was able to grow to 140. Then Nassau put up the cameras and they lasted like a week. And then we called the people operating the Nassau cameras and said, do you have used cameras, gently used cameras that we could buy for a bargain? So we got very inexpensive cameras for our program. But seriously, we were extremely serious about applying this program fairly and in step with the culture. And in line with the data. We wanted our citizens to be with us in this speed camera program. The $50 fine that was allowed, you could also charge an administrative fee. Nassau chose a $30 administrative fee, so people were paying $80. We don't charge an administrative fee. We just charge the $50 even though we could charge the administrative fee. So we were cautious on this, and even with that caution, we have got this program built out. It was all built out by September of 2015. We only finished by September 2015. We still gave out 1 million notices of violation from a program that was a year and a half old. We are about to hit, and don't tweet this, please. We're about 1.9 million. I say in 2 months, we might be at 2 million total notices of violations given out in the life of this program that's under 2 years old. We have 1.9 million personal cars owned in the city of New York. So we're at a 1-to-1 ratio at this point. And it's been managed in a way that we have some elected officials and communities who see this as a revenue grab, but we've done it where the crashes are a problem. We've done it thoughtfully. We've got a methodology that people are accepting this. And this is not about raising revenue. This is about getting those violations to come down. And we're seeing that. So while we're having this initial rollout, this very large amount of violations to start, it's because we're growing the number of cameras, but the violations per camera, and this is on a monthly basis, go down steadily. So, you know, the idea of a speed camera is that you think there's a high probability you'll get enforced. The penalty is so much different than manual enforcement. you think it's a very low probability. In New York, a very low probability you'll be pulled over, but the penalty is much higher. Points on your license, insurance costs, the fine is much higher, if you want to fight it in court, showing up, all of that sort of thing. The $50 really serves as, in essence, a slap on the wrist, no points, and a reminder, and then you say, okay, I'm not going to speed. And the other thing we should all know, you probably all know our speed camera program, is not if you go 1 mile and over the speed limit. By statute, it's if you go 10 miles over the posted speed limit. And we've posted that speed limit, over 4,000 25-mile-an-hour signs. Every one of those signs has a photo-enforced rider under it. So we're trying to tell people, we have a speed camera program. Don't go, and the law said 10, we rounded up. Just like Spinal Tap, we went to 11. So we only give the summons if you go 11 miles an hour over the speed limit, because we don't want anyone complaining about rounding or anything like that. So, stay under 11 miles over, and you won't lose $50. In terms of our engineering, we have, Vision Zero has basically changed bike ped safety work from please beg the federal government for some money and find some grants to do some stuff to this is a mayoral priority. You got to fund mayoral priorities. So we've been able to grow our speed bump program. 82% growth in our sort of neighborhood speed bumps that we put out per year. Signalization strategies, the leading pedestrian interval, which is when we give pedestrians a head start to cross the street, conflict-free from any turning vehicles. We sort of changed our policy. We're going around to those arterials on those maps. Any school crossing near school, we're basically putting in that leading pedestrian interval. So rather than it be request-driven and study-driven, it's sort of systematic. So we did over 400 leading pedestrian intervals at our, we have 13,000 total signalized intersections in 2015, so we're growing that. And then our projects. You saw those pretty pictures in the beginning that we've been doing them and more, but in a much more strategic, targeted way where the data says we have a need. So extending sidewalks with paint and planters near subway stations. Speaking of subway stations, one of our first Vision Zero fatalities was the MTA built a subway station in the middle of the intersection of Broadway and 96th Street. An elderly gentleman, people come off in New York and they want to be able to walk one way or the other way, but you were in the middle of the street. So the MTA built a wall here, and there was a wall here. So an elderly gentleman needed to get home, and he walked here, and there's a left turn signal, and a bus hit him and killed him. And we didn't say there was no crosswalk, and he walked against no light. We said, well, let's find a way to have the crosswalk. So we banned that left turn, took out that left turn signal, widened the median, jackhammered out a hole in the wall, and added the crosswalk. So that's really about the change from us, rather than be defensive around Vision Zero, to ask ourselves, what can we do when these tragedies occur? We're continuing to build out our bike network, making key connections, getting more and more creative with our bicycle facility designs. We are not big fans of roundabouts in our urban area, but we did find one location in the Bronx that had so much asphalt that roundabout made sense, so we built our first roundabout last year. We have bus stations underneath our elevated subway trains where people have to stand in the road to get on the bus, so building out those sidewalks to make them accessible and safer rather than standing in the street. Just more redesigns near schools and senior centers to shorten crossing distances, reduce exposure, complete the bike network, and complete the pedestrian network. We have a lot of irregular intersections where streets meet at angles, and we let people drive, straight down the street, but if you're walking, you have to divert and go this way and this way around. So finding ways to give pedestrians that direct and complete path. And then Queens Boulevard, sort of our signature Vision Zero project, an incredibly complex corridor that intersects with rail rights-of-way, highway rights-of-way, and skews diagonally across the Queens grid, if you can call it a grid, the Queen Street pattern, adding protected bike lanes, solving lots of sort of complex intersection problems, and basically saying that Queens Boulevard should be a true urban boulevard for the people of Queens. We've got Eastern Parkway and Ocean Parkway. Frederick Law Olmsted designed those. They're jewels. They're studied around the country as their community assets. They move a lot of traffic, but they're also community assets where people play chess and walk and bike and meet their neighbor. And Queens Boulevard should be that same boulevard. So we did a rapid operational project for one phase that we will continue on this year, widening the mall with operational materials, adding protected bike lanes, and the mayor has committed over $100 million to build it out in a capital vision with a raised bikeway, walkway, public space, to really create a linear greenway and really transform Queens Boulevard from one of those streets like Jericho Turnpike, rather than dividing neighbor from neighbor, serving as something that bridges and connects neighbor with neighbor. So this work has grown in the Vision Zero era. The miles of protected bike lanes that we've done have grown 90%. The number of projects we've done at priority locations has grown 100%, and the total number of projects that we do has grown by 70% in the Vision Zero era. And this, see the map, it's a really big city, but we're starting to cover more and more of it as we go through and do this work. So, is it working? That's really the big question as we wrap up. And all of this effort being thrown in, what I think Vision Zero, a lot of cities are jumping on board. It's the buzzword of the day. This is a really hard problem. You know, getting it to work requires all of this effort. And I'm happy to say our overall traffic fatalities, we are making a huge dent quickly in that number. So you see the 5 years prior to Vision Zero, we averaged 270 traffic fatalities a year, including almost 300 in the year before Vision Zero. Then we fell to 257 and then 230. If you sort of put a straight line there, that's 111 lives saved in 24 months, which is really, if you think about the loss of one life and the ripple effect that has on families and friends to a traffic crash, the amount of people that this is affecting is, you know, worth much more than what we're spending, that's for sure. For pedestrians, you see that average of 157 in the 5 years before. And in that horrible year right before Vision Zero 2013, 183 pedestrian fatalities. Well, we immediately had our lowest year ever for pedestrian fatalities. The prior record was 140 in 2007. We had 139 and then 133 in 2015. So again, so of those 111 pedestrians, people saved from traffic crashes, 77 are pedestrians when you do that projection. So Vision Zero truly saving lives and serving New Yorkers. So I think the keys to success were obvious as I went through here, but the vision and the commitment at the mayoral, at your executive level, you know, like we could say, oh, Ryan and DOT are doing great technical work, but we need that wind at our backs from the people we work for. The partnership with enforcement, the real culture change happening there, and your police department getting on board and strategic. And then scalable and effective interventions. It can seem like an overwhelming problem, and people like the pretty pictures, but those leading pedestrian intervals, for example, you can't see that. You can't see signal timing, but those 400 locations, you know, probably just as valuable, if not more valuable, than the 60 locations we did, you know, projects on. So you have to find scalable and effective interventions, and then planning and acting where the problems are, not just where the opportunities are. You know, I do think there's a bit of a tension of the complete streets movement. You know, I think Long Island needs a lot of downtown complete streets, and there's a lot of reasons to do that: mobility, economic development, quality of life. You know, that might not be where your traffic fatalities and your serious injuries are. It might be, but you have to sort of consider that as you move forward if you were going to go in the Vision Zero era. So, you know, it's going to entail much more than just these things. It's going to be culture change. Everyone has to collaborate, work together, elected representations, communities, activists, and your technical folks. But you know, if you do get together and push, you really can make a dent. So I really thank you for the opportunity, and I hope you get a little bit of inspiration and think about Vision Zero for Long Island. Thank you.